August 1945. The war was over, but in the desolate plains of Manchuria, Soviet troops advancing toward Harbin found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Scattered over 6 square kilometers were the charred ruins of what had once been a military complex. Dozens of laboratory buildings blown apart, chimneys still smoking, glass vials fused into the concrete from the heat of explosions. Inside, twisted metal tables, burned medical equipment, and bones, human bones, protruding from the mud. There were no signs, no flags, no unit insignias. Just one cryptic marking scratched on a surviving doorplate. Fangi Gyu Sui Bu Benbu, Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department Headquarters. To the Soviet soldiers it made no sense. Why would an epidemic prevention unit have execution pits, crematoriums, and operating theaters with shackles welded to steel tables? Why were there hundreds of dismembered corpses hastily buried in lime trenches behind the facility? Within hours, the Red Army realized this was not a hospital. It was a crime scene, one unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Japanese had fled just days earlier, leaving behind a secret that their government would deny for half a century. Before escaping, they destroyed evidence, killed remaining prisoners, and buried their work beneath tons of explosives. They called it Ichiban, the first unit of epidemic prevention and water supply. But in the coded language of the Imperial Japanese Army, it was known by another name, Unit 731. And what happened here was so horrific, so methodical, that even the Nazis' doctors in Auschwitz would later call it beyond science, beyond evil. For decades it remained hidden, erased from textbooks, protected by governments that should have prosecuted it. Only fragments survived, a few diary entries, scattered testimonies, and the faint, chilling rumors whispered by villagers near Harbin of nights when black trucks came and no one ever returned. This is the story of Unit 731, Japan's secret biological warfare program, a laboratory that used living humans as experimental material in the name of science and empire, a place where death was measured in data sheets and morality was dissected alongside human bodies. And the worst part, the men who ran it were never punished. They were rewarded. The man behind Unit 731 was General Shiro Ishii, a physician, microbiologist, and visionary in the most terrifying sense of the word. Born in 1892 in Chiba, Japan, Ishii was brilliant from the start. Top of his class at Kyoto Imperial University's medical school. But what set him apart wasn't compassion or curiosity. It was ambition without restraint. His colleagues described him as obsessed with glory, intoxicated by his own intelligence. After graduating in 1920, Ishii joined the Imperial Japanese Army's Medical Corps. Within years, he began arguing that biological weapons, bacteria, viruses, and parasites could be as decisive as artillery. He called it the invisible bullet. In 1928, Ishii was sent on a world tour of Europe and America. There he visited research institutes in France, Germany, and the U.S., studying how Western nations were experimenting with biological and chemical warfare after World War I. He returned to Tokyo, convinced if Japan wanted to dominate Asia, it needed to master this new, unseen science. But convincing the military wasn't easy. The concept of germ warfare sounded unethical, even to hardened generals. So Ishii framed it differently. He told them, "The next war will not be won by bullets. It will be won by science." He promised he could create bacteria capable of wiping out entire enemy populations while leaving cities, roads, and infrastructure untouched. The Army liked the efficiency. In 1932, Ishii was given permission to conduct preventive medical research under the guise of public health. That same year, Japan invaded Manchuria, carving out a puppet state called Manchukuo. It was here, far from international scrutiny, that Ishii saw his chance. In 1936, the Japanese Army officially established the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, Boeki Kyusuibu Honbu. The name sounded harmless, but inside the Imperial General Staff, everyone knew what it really meant: a cover for biological warfare. Ishii was placed in charge. His orders were direct: build a secret research facility in occupied China. Develop bacterial weapons for large-scale deployment. Test them on human material, meaning prisoners of war and civilians. The chosen site was near Pingfang, on the outskirts of Harbin. Construction began in 1938 under heavy military secrecy. Local farmers were evicted. Roads were closed. Entire villages were erased from maps. The blueprint called for a vast complex, 150 buildings spread across 6 square kilometers. There were laboratories, pressure chambers, frostbite test rooms, incinerators, and even a specially designed crematorium to handle medical waste. By 1939, the facility was operational. Thousands of Japanese officers and scientists were stationed there. They wore white lab coats and referred to their workplace as Manchuria Number 1 Medical Center. Outsiders never saw the reality that behind the clean white walls, people were dissected alive. And Ishii? He had become the Empire's prized scientist. The Army promoted him to Major General and gave him unlimited funding. He created a system of deception so complete that even the Emperor was told Unit 731 was researching vaccines to protect soldiers from disease. In reality, goal was to weaponize plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, and more, to turn entire cities into petri dishes of death. Within a few years, Ishi built not just one lab, but an entire network of biological warfare units across East Asia. Unit 100 in Changchun, studying anthrax. Unit 1644 in Nanking, testing plague. Unit 1855 in Beijing, all reporting to Ishi and Pingfang. He called it the Holy Empire of Bacterial Science. The Japanese High Command called it the edge of a new kind of war. But to the prisoners who entered those walls, men, women, and children, it was a one-way gate to hell. Pingfang, 20 kilometers south of Harbin, a small industrial town swallowed by the frozen plains of northern Manchuria. By the late 1930s, the locals knew to stay away. Those who ventured too close to the fenced compound vanished. The ones who lived nearby spoke of a strange smell that rolled over the fields at night, a mix of burnt flesh and carbolic acid. Unit 731's main complex was built like a city. It had its own power plant, waterworks, rail spur, barracks, laboratories, workshops, and even an airfield. On paper, it looked like a modern research institute. In reality, it was a factory of death operating under surgical precision. The perimeter was surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guard towers watched every angle. Inside, armed sentries patrolled day and night. Each building had its own coded designation. Room 1, Building 8, Block R. None of the staff used the term prisoner. The official term was maruta, meaning logs. To them, human beings were experimental material. The prisoners came from everywhere. Chinese civilians accused of espionage, captured Soviet soldiers, Mongolians and Koreans. Even Allied prisoners of war captured in Southeast Asia were transferred here. They arrived in sealed trains, stripped, numbered, and locked inside small concrete cells measuring barely 2 meters across. The cells were soundproof. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams. In winter, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, but the prisoners were given no heating, part of the observation environment. Every morning, guards wearing masks and rubber gloves delivered food, rice mixed with rotten vegetables through a slot. Many never lived long enough to finish it. The scientists of Unit 731 weren't monsters in appearance. They were doctors, professors, and surgeons trained in Japan's best universities. Their white coats were spotless. Their instruments, German scalpels, Swiss thermometers, Japanese microscopes, were sterilized to perfection. They worked in teams. Each team had a goal. Some studied plague bacteria. Others tested chemical agents, frostbite treatment, or wound infection. Ishii demanded reliable data, and reliability meant the subject had to be alive during every step. Former technicians later testified that they performed vivisections, live dissections, without anesthesia. They wanted to study organ function before death, One nurse recalled watching a prisoner's stomach being cut open, as the man's heart rate was recorded in real time. Another technician described injecting horse urine into prisoners' kidneys to measure renal failure. Outside the main lab stood rows of cages holding animals: rats, rabbits, horses, cows, and goats, used as carriers for disease cultures. Rats were bred by the thousands to cultivate plague fleas. The fleas were then placed in ceramic bombs designed to shatter on impact, releasing infection over wide areas. Every week, trucks arrived carrying new prisoners. Every month, the crematorium burned day and night. The smoke never stopped. The facility's medical records were written with clinical detachment. Each entry ended the same way: material expired. Few of the staff questioned what they were doing. Most were proud. They saw themselves as pioneers of biological defense. Many believed their research would make Japan untouchable. One doctor, when later interrogated by the Soviets, said, "We did not think of them as humans. We thought of them as data." By 1942, Unit 731 had grown into a fully integrated research production center capable of mass-producing biological weapons. It had 3,000 staff, including doctors, engineers, and soldiers. At its peak, it could cultivate 300 kilograms of plague bacteria every few days, enough to wipe out an entire city. The horror inside Pingfang was not chaos. It was order, the kind that can only exist when morality is scientifically erased. And yet for Ishii, it wasn't enough. He wanted to take his discoveries beyond the laboratory, to the battlefield. The next phase of his work would leave the walls of Manchuria and infect entire towns. By 1940, General Shiro Ishii believed that Unit 731 had perfected the science of mass infection. The laboratory data was clear, the pathogen stable, and the methods efficient. Now it was time to move from theory to application, and the Empire gave him the permission he wanted. What followed was not research. It was weapon testing on a scale no one in history had attempted. The first operational trials began across occupied China in late 1940. Ishii's teams loaded ceramic bombs with plague-infested fleas, cholera bacteria, and anthrax spores. These bombs, codenamed Uji-50, were dropped from Japanese aircraft over Ningbo, Changde, and Hunan provinces. The ceramic casings shattered perfectly on impact, dispersing their living contents across fields, rivers, and villages. Within days, the first outbreaks began. Entire towns were consumed by fever and blackened sores. Chinese reports describe people dying in the streets, bodies swelling with bubonic plague. One of Ishii's officers later confessed that he observed ideal infection patterns from the air. Thousands died, mostly civilians, farmers, and children. The soldiers called it efficient. In one 1942 operation in Zhejiang province, Japanese troops released fleas by hand, scattering them over rice fields as if planting seeds. The infection spread so fast that even Japanese soldiers began dying. But the results, in Ishii's eyes, were invaluable data. When plague wasn't enough, Ishii's men turned to waterborne diseases. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery bacteria were dumped into wells and reservoirs in occupied Chinese towns. Eyewitnesses from the city of Chengde recalled Japanese trucks arriving with barrels labeled disinfectant. In reality, they carried cultures of Vibrio cholerae. Within days, hospitals overflowed. Within weeks, the city became a mass grave. Historians estimate over 200,000 Chinese civilians died in these biological attacks between 1940 and 1942. To expand testing, Ishii established smaller field laboratories, subunits across Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, and coastal China. Each was commanded by a medical officer trained at Pingfang. Their mission? Infect prisoners under natural conditions. One surviving Japanese medic described a test outside Anda, Manchuria. Prisoners were tied to stakes at varying distances from an explosive device filled with plague fleas. After detonation, the team recorded infection times, body temperatures, and stages of swelling. The entire process was photographed for Ishii's archives. Those who didn't die immediately were dissected to study internal damage. As the war turned against Japan, Ishii sought new delivery methods. His team experimented with balloon bombs, similar to those later used in Operation Outward, but carrying bacterial agents instead of explosives. Balloons filled with plague or anthrax spores were launched into the wind, designed to drift into Chinese territory or even across the Pacific. Most crashed before reaching targets. But the tests continued into 1944. American intelligence would later find documents proving that Ishii had proposed infecting San Diego, California, with plague-carrying balloons in 1945. An operation codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan was canceled only after Japan's surrender. Ironically, Ishii also fought. Behind the barbed wire of Pingfang, life and death were laboratory variables. For the doctors of Unit 731, the human body was no longer sacred. It was a test subject, a biological instrument. Every morning began with the same command from Ishii's staff chief: prepare the maruta. That phrase meant one thing: bring out the prisoners for experimentation. Harbin's winters plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and Ishii wanted to know how far the human body could survive in extreme cold. Guards marched prisoners, men, women, even children, into the open courtyards and ordered them to expose their arms to the freezing air. To accelerate the process, buckets of water were poured over the limbs until the skin froze solid. Technicians would then strike the frozen flesh with a stick. When the sound changed from a dull thud to a sharp crack, the limb was ready. That was the signal that it had frozen all the way through. Then in the lab, they thawed it, sometimes with warm water, sometimes by open flame, to observe tissue decay. One former assistant, Yoshio Shinozuka, later confessed, "We could see the line where the dead flesh ended and the living began. We cut there, measured, and wrote it down. Perhaps the most infamous experiments were the vivisections. The goal, Ishii claimed, was to study the progression of disease inside a living body. Anesthesia, he said, would contaminate results. Subjects infected with plague, cholera, syphilis, or tuberculosis were strapped to surgical tables. The procedures were carried out with precision, organs removed, blood replaced with seawater or animal serum, limbs amputated, lungs inflated or collapsed. Every reaction was recorded. The doctors took notes, discussed results over tea, and then incinerated the remains. They called this pathological mapping. When later questioned by American and Soviet interrogators, some physicians insisted they were serving the empire and that the subjects were condemned spies. But the truth, recorded in diaries recovered from the site, revealed otherwise. Many victims were ordinary farmers or refugees taken from the countryside. Their only crime was being alive in the wrong place. Another team tested decompression. Subjects were locked inside airtight steel chambers. Pressure was dropped suddenly to simulate high-altitude conditions. Eyes ruptured. Blood boiled. Organs burst. One technician recalled how Ishii ordered them to continue lowering the pressure until the subject ceased movement. The readings were logged on charts with the title, Data for Aviation Medicine. To study battlefield injuries, prisoners were shot at varying distances and calibers. Others were tied to stakes while grenades or flamethrowers were tested nearby. Doctors observed blood loss, infection speed, and the effects of gangrene. They recorded how long it took for subjects to die without treatment, and whether different dressings delayed the inevitable. Every outcome was a data point. Every corpse was a report. Unit 731 also ran experiments on syphilis and gonorrhea. Male prisoners were deliberately infected, then ordered to assault female captives to monitor transmission rates. Pregnant women were later vivisected to study fetal infection. No records mention anesthesia. Years later, nurses admitted they were ordered to treat patients as bacteria, not people. Ishii's obsession was scientific cleanliness. He told subordinates that bacteria must be observed in the living. Dead bodies, he said, were useless for science. So everything was timed. The exact second infection began. The hour fever peaked. The minute breathing stopped. Corpses were dissected within 10 minutes to preserve internal organs untainted by decay. The prisoners' names were never written, only codes and numbers. In Ishii's world, individuality had been mathematically deleted. For the Japanese personnel, horror was routine. After morning experiments, they had lunch in the cafeteria, attended evening lectures, and played baseball on weekends. Children of officers went to school near the compound. One recalled hearing strange cries at night, but was told they were animals. Inside the walls, the doctors congratulated each other on valuable findings. They wrote papers titled "Prevention of Plague Through Controlled Infection." None were ever published publicly. All were marked top secret for imperial use. Exact numbers will never be known. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 12,000 people were killed inside Unit 731 alone. But across all Japanese biological units in China, the true toll may have exceeded 300,000 civilian deaths, most from field test outbreaks. Every one of those deaths was converted into a data table in Ishii's archives, the sum of a decade's worth of scientific progress. By 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing. American bombers were burning Tokyo. Soviet armies were moving through Manchuria. Ishii knew what would happen if the world discovered what he had done. He ordered all facilities destroyed, all prisoners executed, and all records burned. The men of Unit 731 began preparing their final experiment, the erasure of history itself. Summer 1945. Japan's empire was burning to ash. The U.S. had firebombed Tokyo into ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would soon follow. And in the north, the Soviet Union began its long-promised invasion of Manchuria. For Shiro Ishii, it meant the end of his empire of science. He summoned his officers to the Pingfang Command Building and gave a single order: erase everything. Nothing must fall into enemy hands. The destruction of Unit 731 began on August 9th, 1945. The same day, the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. Laboratory notebooks, charts, tissue slides, and cultures were thrown into furnaces. Vats of plague bacteria were flooded with formaldehyde. The glass containers that could not be burned were smashed with hammers. Every building was wired with explosives. At dawn on August 10th, the detonations echoed across the plains. Chimneys collapsed, walls caved in, and the great autoclaves used for sterilization turned red from heat. By noon, nothing recognizable remained, just twisted metal and black smoke curling over the soybean fields. Inside the underground cells, hundreds of prisoners still lived. They were not to be liberated. Guards dragged them into the courtyards, shot them, or injected them with poisons. Others were burned alive inside locked barracks. The crematorium ran until its fuel ran out. Technicians destroyed the cages of plague-infected rats, releasing thousands into the surrounding countryside. Villages miles away would later report unexplained outbreaks of bubonic plague that killed hundreds after the war ended. It was Ishii's last data set, unintended, uncontrolled, and utterly catastrophic. As the Soviets closed in, Ishii and his senior staff fled Harbin by train, disguised as ordinary soldiers. They carried suitcases filled with microfilm copies of research notes and gold bars supplied by the Kwantung Army. Some escaped to Japan. Others blended into the collapsing military bureaucracy. The rank-and-file personnel were ordered to disappear. Many committed suicide. Others were absorbed into medical units stationed in Korea. When Soviet troops reached Pingfang on August 19th, they expected to find a hospital. Instead, they found scorched ruins, pools of chemical residue, and human bones fused into the foundations of the destroyed laboratories. Army doctors sent reports to Moscow describing a facility for mass human experimentation. They collected surgical tools, cages, and fragments of ceramic bomb casings etched with Japanese serial numbers. Nearby villagers told investigators about the nights of explosions, the smell of burning bodies, and the black water that flowed into the Songhua River for days afterward. The Soviets immediately sealed the area and began interrogations of captured Japanese officers. Within months, they had enough evidence to launch one of the most secret trials of the post-war era, the Khabarovsk War Crimes Tribunal, which would reveal to the world what Unit 731 had done. But before those hearings could begin, another power had already moved to protect Ishii's men. Across the Pacific, American intelligence officers were also looking for the scientists of Unit 731, not to punish them, but to hire them. When the guns of World War II fell silent, most expected the men of Unit 731 to face the same justice as the Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. They had murdered thousands in the name of science. They had produced mountains of evidence, if anyone had the will to use it. But in the months after Japan's surrender, something else happened. A quiet bargain, one that rewrote the moral boundaries of victory. In September 1945, U.S. Army investigators attached to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters began hearing reports from Chinese and Soviet sources about epidemic units in Manchuria. At first, Washington dismissed them as propaganda. Then photographs emerged. Ruins of laboratories, bones, and strange ceramic bomb fragments. By late 1946, U.S. intelligence had captured and questioned several Japanese medical officers, including Ishii's deputies. General Masaji Kitano, Colonel Ryoichi Naito, and Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii himself. They did not deny the experiments. Instead, they offered something else. "We can give you all our data," Ishii said, "but it must not be used in court." He promised information on plague, anthrax, cholera, and frostbite, the kind of data only obtainable through live human experimentation. Information that even the Americans' own bioweapon scientists at Camp Dietrich had been struggling to obtain. To U.S. military scientists in 1947, the Cold War was already beginning. The Soviet Union was developing its own biological programs. To them, Ishii's notebooks weren't evidence of crimes. They were potential weapons intelligence. A classified memo from the U.S. Chemical Corps, dated May 6, 1947, stated, "This information has been obtained at a cost of many human lives and could never be duplicated in our laboratories due to moral and ethical limitations." The memo concluded that the data was of great value to the United States. General MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, personally authorized the deal. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii and his top scientists would hand over their complete research archives to American intelligence. They were to remain uncharged at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. U.S. prosecutors at Nuremberg had executed Nazi doctors for far less. But in Tokyo, the words Unit 731 were never even mentioned in open court. The immunity deal transformed monsters into professionals overnight. Shiro Ishii retired quietly in Japan, never indicted, and later advised Japan's Ministry of Health. Masaji Kitano became president of the Green Cross Pharmaceutical Company. Ryoichi Naito helped found Japan's national blood bank system. Many others became professors of medicine, teaching at universities under their real names. They lived long lives, some dying peacefully in the 1980s, never having faced a single day in prison. In December 1949, the Soviets staged the Khabarovsk trials, where 12 captured Japanese officers confessed in detail to human experimentation and biological warfare. Transcripts described vivisections, plague bombs, and Ishii's orders to exterminate evidence. Western powers dismissed the hearings as communist propaganda. Only decades later, when declassified U.S. documents matched Soviet testimony line by line, did historians realize the Soviets had been telling the truth. The United States buried the Unit 731 files deep within military archives marked top secret. For 40 years, nothing was publicly acknowledged. The victims received no compensation, no recognition, not even an official record that they had existed. In exchange for data, the victors had absolved the guilty. Justice was traded for information that was never even used. One declassified Defense Technical Information Center report from the 1950s admitted that the Japanese results were scientifically unreliable. Sloppy records gathered by doctors who didn't understand basic control methods. But by then, the moral damage was irreversible. When asked after the war whether he regretted anything, a former Unit 731 researcher said, "We were never punished, so I thought it was right." That single sentence summed up the entire immunity deal. A generation of scientists learned that if their crimes were valuable enough, they could be forgiven. And for the thousands who died in Ping-Fang, there was only silence. For nearly 40 years after the war, Unit 731 existed only as a rumor. Japan's post-war textbooks skipped it. U.S. archives sealed it. And those who tried to speak were silenced by the same phrase repeated in government offices and university corridors. No record, no evidence, no such unit ever existed. But ghosts leave traces, even when history tries to erase them. In the early 1950s, scattered stories began to surface in rural Manchuria. Villagers remembered the water supply station that emitted black smoke day and night. Farmers digging near Ping-Fang unearthed bones that were clearly human, many small enough to belong to children. Still, in Cold War Japan, few dared to investigate. The first real break came not from Tokyo, but from the Soviet Union. The Khabarovsk trial transcripts, published in 1950, contained detailed confessions from former officers. Western governments dismissed them as communist propaganda, and the documents were ignored. For decades, the truth lay buried in Russian-language archives. Inside Japan, silence was official policy. The Ministry of Education censored any mention of biological warfare in school curricula. When survivors' families petitioned for information, the government replied that all records had been destroyed. Former Unit 731 doctors were protected by academic institutions that valued their post-war research more than accountability. Some of those same men were lecturing on microbiology, publishing medical papers, even developing commercial vaccines. Their students never knew what kind of research had made their mentors famous. By the 1980s, a new generation of Japanese journalists began to challenge the silence. Foremost among them was Harumi Shimizu, who spent years tracking down veterans of the Kwantung Army. One elderly technician, overcome by guilt, finally confessed on record that he had dissected living prisoners. His testimony, broadcast on Japanese television in 1981, shocked the nation. Soon after, others began to speak. Former nurses, orderlies, and guards described the vivisections, frostbite experiments, and the final destruction of the compound. For the first time, Japan's citizens could hear the truth from their own people. In 1984, construction workers in Tokyo discovered thousands of human bones beneath a former military medical site in the capital's Shinjuku district. Dental records and surgical markings matched descriptions from Ping-Fang. The Japanese government quietly removed the remains and stored them in secrecy for over a decade. In China, survivors and historians documented outbreaks of plague and cholera in regions where Unit 731 had operated. Archived reports from Chinese hospitals showed that the epidemics matched the exact months and locations of Japanese biological attacks. The evidence was no longer theoretical. It was forensic. In the 1990s, under public pressure and the U.S. Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, the National Archives finally released thousands of pages of previously classified documents. Among them were U.S. Army memos confirming the immunity deal, payment records to Japanese officers, and summaries of the human experimentation data transferred to Camp Detrick. A 1998 U.S. Department of Justice report quietly admitted the United States government accepted information that should have been rejected and shielded war criminals from prosecution. It was the first and only official acknowledgement of complicity. Meanwhile, Chinese historians opened their own archives. In 2018, the Heilongjiang Provincial Archives released over 12,000 pages of original Japanese documents, construction blueprints, research notes, and prisoner logs. Forensic teams mapped mass graves around Pingfang and identified bone fragments with drill marks consistent with vivisection. The evidence was irrefutable. What survivors had whispered for decades was proven beyond doubt. Despite overwhelming proof, Japan's government has never issued a formal state apology or legal reparations to victims of Unit 731. Lawsuits filed by Chinese survivors in Tokyo District Court have been dismissed on technical grounds. Judges admitting the atrocities occurred, but claiming sovereign immunity prevents compensation. Even today, some nationalist politicians call the story exaggerated. But among Japan's younger historians, a different voice is rising, one demanding that denial end. Only a handful of survivors lived long enough to testify publicly. One, a Chinese woman named Wang Zhuan, lost her grandfather in a plague outbreak seeded by Japanese aircraft. She spent her life gathering testimonies from victims' families, creating the first civil archive of Unit 731's crimes. In an interview before her death, she said, "They took our people, used them like insects, and told the world it never happened. I do not want revenge. I want remembrance." Her words captured what governments would not admit, that history's worst atrocities do not vanish. They are only postponed until truth finds its voice. In recent years, museums in both China and Japan have begun exhibiting artifacts from Unit 731, surgical tools, photographs, uniforms, and surviving blueprints. At Pingfang, the main laboratory ruins have been preserved as a memorial. Tour guides lead visitors past the crematorium foundations, the cells, the dissecting rooms. Silent testimony to what science becomes when stripped of ethics. Every year, a small group of former Japanese medics visits the site, now old and frail. Some kneel in apology. Others remain expressionless. But the records no longer belong to them. They belong to history. 80 years later, the shadow of Unit 731 still stretches across Asia, not as a headline, but as a question that refuses to die. What happens when a civilization decides that morality is a variable and science is a weapon? The men of Unit 731 were not madmen from another age. They were university educated, fluent in medicine, fluent in statistics. They went to work each morning believing they were serving progress. And that is what makes their story unbearable. The idea that ordinary intellect, stripped of empathy, can industrialize cruelty. Modern bioethics owes its existence to that realization. The 1947 Nuremberg Code, written after the trial of Nazi doctors, set the world's first rules for humane research. But because Unit 731 was erased from the record, Japan never faced its own Nuremberg. The code came from Europe's horror, not Asia's. The vacuum of justice left an open wound that still bleeds through silence and denial. Every generation of scientists confronts the same temptation: to chase discovery faster than ethics can follow. From nuclear testing to genetic manipulation, the ghosts of Ping Fang hover over every laboratory where ambition outruns restraint. One historian wrote, "The crime of Unit 731 was not that they failed as scientists, but that they succeeded without humanity. Their success, bacteria weaponized, vaccines forged through torture, proved that progress without moral boundaries isn't progress at all. It's regression, disguised as knowledge." Inside Japan, the debate continues. Textbooks mention Unit 731 only in passing, if at all. Survivors groups still petition for acknowledgement, while nationalist politicians call it anti-Japanese propaganda. Yet a quiet reckoning grows each year. Students visit the museum at Ping Fang, record survivor interviews, and ask the questions their grandparents never dared to voice. Some former soldiers have broken the code of silence, appearing in documentaries to say two words that took half a century to form: "We're sorry." It is not enough, but it is a beginning. In declassified U.S. files, the research notebooks of Unit 731 remain stored. Thousands of pages of temperature charts, autopsy notes, infection curves. They sit in boxes labeled historical material. No one uses them now. Modern medicine considers them ethically void, scientifically contaminated. They exist only as evidence of what happens when truth itself is dissected. One American biowarfare officer who reviewed the data in the 1950s wrote privately, "I read the notes of men who thought they were doctors. What I saw were engineers of death. For every government that hid the truth, Japanese, American, Soviet, the cost was moral authority. The victims were denied justice, and the perpetrators were rewarded with careers. In doing so, the victors blurred the line between civilization and barbarism. History does not only judge what was done, it judges what was allowed to be forgotten." Today, the ruins of Ping Fang stand under gray skies. Grass grows through the concrete. The crematorium's chimney still leans at an angle, blackened by smoke that no wind has ever fully carried away. Schoolchildren walk through the corridors with masks over their faces, not out of fear, but respect. On the wall, a single plaque bears the words, "Let this place be a mirror." So long as man seeks power without conscience, another Ping Fang will rise. In the end, Unit 731 was not a secret lab buried in Manchuria. It was a warning that knowledge, in the wrong hands, can become the most efficient form of evil. The doctors who called themselves scientists proved one truth beyond debate. Human progress is not measured by what we can do to the body, but by what we refuse to do to it. If this story disturbed you, it should, because it means you're still human. Subscribe to WW2 Declassified to uncover the histories the world tried to erase.